Is it recording?
Yes.
Okay, all right then, I'll get going. So hello everybody, and welcome to this ODPi webinar. And on today's call, we're going to talk about some work that we've been doing around the data privacy pack. And there's a fair amount of information, but hopefully this will give you a flavour of the work that's going on. So the person speaking is Maddy Chessel, and I'm the PMC lead for the work on data governance, which also includes a new open source project called Rehearsal. And Regeria's role is to create technology that allows different vendors to exchange metadata and to collaborate, or for their tools to collaborate around data governance. We're also very focused on producing best practices around data governance, and that's going to be a lot of what I'm going to cover today. So this is just a little bit of summary of the key work that we're doing. So one of the important points here is that both the Rehearsal work and the data governance best practice work that we're doing is all open source. And so you can pick up any of the material that I'm showing on our GitHub repositories, which are linked to below. Now, the data privacy pack itself is one of our pieces of work. And the aim is to look at the problem of data privacy and produce a best practice guide, additional resources and technologies in open source that are designed to support the data privacy officer. And we'll talk a little bit about what that role is and the types of capabilities that they need. So we're going to start with a little bit of background as to why privacy is so important to today's organizations. We're going to look at the life cycle of a digital service. So think of a digital service as maybe a product that you offer on the internet or a support web or something on a mobile application, or maybe an IoT solution. It's basically anything that's using information technology, that's storing and managing data. And then we're going to look at that in terms of what would be needed to change in order to ensure everyone's privacy. We're going to use a set of scenarios from a fictitious company called Pharmaceuticals, where we have a number of personas that will show walking through the process of building a new mobile application, and also looking at working on a data science project. And so we'll see in both of those how they're impacted by considerations of data privacy. We'll look at how we're extending Rehearsal, which is the technology code base, and then explain what's happening next. So let's start with the privacy challenge. Why is this so important? It's difficult for anyone not to have heard of a new regulation called the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. It comes from the European Union, and it establishes some very strict criteria about how organisations are allowed to process personal data of EU citizens, irrespective of where that processing is occurring. So it tends to affect a lot of multinational companies and companies where they have European customers. One of the things that makes it very difficult is that the definition of personal data is very broad, and it really covers anything that could identify an individual. And it says that pretty much you can't process their data without their permission. Now, there are caveats around that, and what that broad statement means, is pretty well defined. But actually, it does tend to cover a very large amount of the data services that most organisations have. And as individuals now, we're using digital services in almost every aspect of our lives. And so questions of privacy are important to us all. So that was one of the reasons we took this as our first topic. So here I've just created a link to the General Data Protection Regulation if you want to look it up yourself. You can see the definitions and guidance that is available. And the interesting thing is that although the GDPR was originally for for Europe, its influence is spreading around the world. And so recently California passed an act that is that has a lot of the flavour of the GDPR. And so we're going to see these themes appearing all around the world. They'll be slightly different in different places, but there's a lot of commonality between them. So let's talk about Coco Pharmaceuticals. As I said, this is a fictitious organisation. And so all the characters that we talk about really are they're not real people, but they are made up of scenarios and individuals from, sort of characteristics of individuals from many different companies. So it's a blending of different use cases. They all come from real situations though. So the fictitious organisation is a pharmaceutical that's vertically integrated. So it does its own research, manufacturing, sales, and distribution of their products. But they're very specialised. They work on medication for cancer sufferers, and they're focusing on personalised medicine. So you can imagine they're using a lot of data and a lot of sensitive data about people. And also they work with business partners. So they work with hospitals for research. They also work with universities as well. So they've got questions of how they use that data and share that data with different organisations. Here are some of the characters, and there's a link there to link you to all of the descriptions of the personas that we're using in this. But basically we have, it's a medium-sized business. They have a newly appointed chief data officer. They have staff who are deep experts in research. They have a privacy officer. They have a small IT department. So this is an organisation that is not that is basically focused on research and not on IT. So although they have people, the IT team is very small and very stretched. So let's talk a little bit about the privacy officer, our target user ID for user for this particular privacy pack. So the persona in Coco Pharmaceuticals is Face Broker. She's actually the Director of Human Resources, but she's got a background in compliance, and as a result, she's been asked to take on the privacy officer role in the organisation. And this is not uncommon, that this role is being given to an awful lot of people today, because many organisations are discovering that they need a privacy officer because the legislation is becoming so strict. And having somebody focusing on this aspect and looking at how an organisation needs to adapt is extremely important. Now, this has come from the GDPR, and it starts to talk about what do we mean by personal data. So this is the data that we're trying to protect around data privacy activity. And as I said before, it's anything that identifies a living individual. And what's interesting is techniques that seem to anonymize that data, de-identify that data. If there is a way of getting back to that individual through that de-anonymization, you still have to treat it as personal data. It's only when it's impossible to recover who that person was can you truly say that this is no longer personal data. And it covers any type of processing, even manual processing. So you really have to think very carefully about how you process data about people and all aspects of that processing. So it's a very, very broad regulation. So one of the very first things that a privacy officer needs to do is to come up with a company definition of the types of data that they have and what and how they would characterize their definition of personal data. So each organization has sort of collects a different types of data. There's a lot of commonality, but each company needs a definition so that their people can know when they're working with personal data. So one of the things we've done as part of this piece of work is to create a fairly detailed definition of all the different types of data that could be considered personal data. And that's available in the Git repository. Now let's start stepping into what do we mean by data a digital service and how it flows through its life cycle. So what we mean, as we go to here, what do we mean by the digital service life cycle? We mean what happens to a digital service, such as a mobile app, as it goes through the planning stage, the development stage, we deploy it out so it's available for customers, how people sign up to buy it, how it's used, and then what happens if there's a problem with the data, you know, in terms of a data breach, and then what happens in the next release as we go around. So this is what we mean by the digital life cycles. Now, given that that definition of personal data is so broad, really, when you start to think about designing for privacy, you pretty much have to say that an organization needs to change their management of their digital services to assume that there is personal data in every one, and then just pick out the odd ones that don't have that, that piece, rather than sort of having an exception process for personal data. So really what you're looking at is how do you change the way you work, assuming that everything is personal data, and use that as your most common process. So this is a picture that we've already seen. Now, what I've got around here, you can see the sort of standard phases in yellow, and then I've got these additional documents and assessments and descriptions sitting around it, and these are the extra bits that need to be added into the process to actually manage privacy. Because what you're trying to do is to identify where that personal data is, where the risks are to individuals' privacy, and try to minimize those risks through reducing the amount of data you keep, how long you keep it, who you share it with, and trying to get the processing to be as lean as possible in its use of data. And I'm going to go through each step in more detail, but basically you can see at the planning stage, you're trying to understand the value and impact of the use of personal data. In the development stage, you're trying to get an accurate description of what you're doing. That then is validated as the service is deployed, and there's a view of security to make sure that that service is, you know, the data can't be compromised. Then as the service is sold, the people buying it sign up to terms and conditions, and that should describe how the data is being used so that they can agree to your use of the data. This is part of giving consent. And then when they're using the service, they need to be able to turn on and off use of different types of data, plus also request access to their data, request their data is deleted, and various other rights around it. So that's like personal data management. And then there are all the procedures about how you handle a data breach, because that's something that needs to be reported to the regulators. And it's extremely important that the organisation is prepared, organised, and ready to deal with that that situation, because it can be extremely damaging to the organisation. So that's the life cycle. Let's actually go through those steps using Cocoa Pharmaceutical Persona, just to see what that would look like in real life. So we're going to start with one of the researchers, Tessa, and she's basically involved in creating new personalised cancer treatments. And so she does an awful lot of data science, plus she's working at hospitals, she's working with patients, she's testing a lot of her drugs through clinical trials. And she's about to start a new clinical trial and wants to improve both the quality and quantity of data that's collected during that trial. And so she's got this idea that if the medical staff and the patients had tablets or digital or phones, that they could actually record information as it's happening, then hopefully they would get much better information in terms of, data collection around the clinical trial itself. Now here, of course, we're looking to collect very personal data from a variety of people. And so questions of privacy comes up in terms of how do we keep that data safe and being used appropriately. So she starts by talking to the Chief Data Officer to get his advice, because she knows that they need to be conformant with the regulations around their industry. Between them, they come up with a number of questions that they need to answer in order to be sure of the approach, which is how do they ensure the data is safe on the mobile device? How do they ensure that they've got accurate data coming in? How do they move that data from the mobile device into their data lake so that it can be accumulated and analysed? How do they manage the data once it's in the data lake? And how do they demonstrate that any results that comes from that data actually can be validated and used in terms of proof that this was a good clinical trial? So that's their initial set of questions, and you know, they're being fairly responsible about protecting the data and making sure that it's accurate. They ask the architect to sketch out the solution, which she does here, and you can start to see where data is flowing, where it's being stored in this very initial sketch. So they also then ask Faith, who's the Chief Privacy Officer, about the privacy angle. And what you see here are the list of additional questions that come up when you're considering privacy. So the previous set, we're looking at security and quality of the data. And now we start to look at, is the scope of the data collected actually of value to the organisation? So is it appropriate for the particular application? Then we start to look at the risks. Now, when we talk about privacy risks, we're not talking about risks to the organisation. We're talking about risks to the individual whose data is being collected. Then we need to find out how we're going to get consent for processing that personal data. And then how are we going to support the data subject's rights? So this is things like right to be deleted, right to have their data corrected, right to see what data you've offered. So there's a number of requests that data subjects are allowed to do, and we need to support it around that. And that might be directly through the actual mobile application, or it might be through manual processes and phoning up and asking for it. All of that has to now be designed into the solution. Now, if we start looking at the process of building this service, these questions, answering these questions is really in the planning stage. And we've got two documents to do that. The first is the data value assessment, and this is where we think about the value of the data and make sure the data is appropriate for the use. And then if through that process there's a recognition that this could have a risk to individuals from a privacy perspective, then you work on data processing impact assessment, or you may have heard of this as a privacy impact assessment. This is a new term for the assessment, to actually look at how you mitigate risks. So I've got a little bit more detail coming up. So here we have the data value assessment. So you understand what data is required, and you explain why is it needed and how long is it kept. And it's all about, is this data appropriate? Is there additional data, more data than's being needed, being collected, and is it being kept for longer than is appropriate? So this is about what we call data minimization. And then the other one, the data processing impact assessment, is about risk and risk to the individuals and how you mitigate against that risk. And I've included some a link here to some good advice about how to actually do these data protection impact assessments, which is from the ICO, which is the UK's regulator around data protection. Now, the other thing that was in that list was around consent. So basically, you can't process personal data without consent. And there's two primary ways of doing this. The first is that when you sign up to a service, the particular use of particular types of data about you are so fundamental to the operation of the service that without that data, you couldn't do anything. So, for example, you couldn't really have a bank account without them knowing your name and address so that they can send you information about how much money you've got. So there's some data that's absolutely fundamental, and you agree to people using that data when you sign up to the service. So these are the terms and conditions you sign when you sign up. And that's sort of almost like mandatory data use. And then there'll be optional data use that you then give consent to, and by default it has to be off. So they can't start using data until you explicitly say yes. So there's two parts of sort of designing for consent. The first is deciding what we call this legitimate interest, which is this, what would be in the terms and conditions and mandatory data use. And then how do you then seek further consent for more optional capabilities and that would enhance the service or allow you to collect more data and understand your users better, or to collect additional information for research or whatever. So this is where you say, I want additional data in order to use it for this purpose, and can I, and the end user is then able to say yes or no. So this, again, this has to be part of the design of the solution and thought about it at a very early stage. The other thing to think about is that in many organizations, you actually start using services from other partners. So in the regulation, it talks about different responsibilities. And the first responsibility is what we call the controller. So this is the organization that is basically designing and owning the service that the end user sees. And they may then call services from other organizations, and they are then called processors, data processors. And when one of the responsibilities of the controller is to make sure that all of the data that's passed to the processor has permission to do that processing. And the processor then has to demonstrate that they're only doing the processing that they have permission to do. Where there's additional consent, optional consent from the actual application, from the end user, then that needs to be distributed to both the processor and the controller as appropriate. So if the processor needs to understand what that additional consent is, then they need to make sure they have access to it. So all of this needs to be thought through quite early. And the other thing to think about, so in this application specifically, you've got medical staff and patients collecting data. And both the medical staff and the patients are actually data subjects, because you might be collecting data about the end user, who is this person, what's their contact details, when were they using the system, and so when the nurse is entering data about one of the patients, then they are both data subjects for that data entry. And then obviously when the patient's entering information about themselves, then they're a data subject too. So you need to think about both the end users and who the data is about when you're considering the data subjects and their rights around the data. And here's a list of the types of rights that the data owners, the data subjects, have, which is to be informed of any problems with the data. They need to be able to access it. They need to be fixable. They need to remove it. They need to be able to turn off processing they don't agree with. They need to be able to export and take that data somewhere else, and to object to certain decisions that are being made around on their behalf around the use of the data. And so all of that, again, needs to be built into the design of the system. So moving through the development process, we're getting into more detailed design. Here we've got the architect is joined by a cloud specialist who's helping to make sure that all the components in the cloud service can then be safely connected to the on-premise environment, the data lake environment. And often in a cloud environment, you've got lots of different types of services that themselves need to be integrated in order to get to ensure both security, but also that you've kept track of where data is located in all places. Now, one of the things that's necessary is during the development process to create an accurate description of how personal data is being processed. And this is really about when is it collected, where is it stored, who is it shared with, what is it used for, and how is in terms of what is it used for, in terms of what are all the purposes that data is used for, and the and how secured it is, I suppose. So we call those data processing descriptions, and they end up being quite structured text around each different type of different data set. And during the development process, the team will actually produce this type of documentation, and then that is then included in the documentation for the asset, and it also becomes potentially part of the contract, the terms and conditions for when people sign up for that legitimate interest approach to consent. Now, one of the advantages of doing that type of analysis and documentation is that you can start to pick up places where either the description can't be complete, or where you're actually starting to collect more data than you're actually using, or you can justify. So you might have data sets defined, but actually there's no description of how the processing is working. There doesn't seem to be a way to delete a particular type of data, or it seems to appear but it's never been collected. So there's lots of checks and balances you can do around these processing descriptions to help with the assurance that actually you're processing data appropriately. Now we get into the development process. So here we've got one of a contractor here that is building the application. Of course, that includes the request for consent permissions around the use of data, as well as the other services may well be included in that application. As we get into the integration services, the tasks around integrating it are way more than just making the service work. It's about making sure the flow of data is minimalized, making sure that there's proper record of where the data is, what the APIs do, how they're secured, making sure encryption's in progress, and ensuring that there's proper logging to make sure that they know that they haven't lost any data along the way. So there's a lot of additional services that really need to go into here so that the flow and use of information is tightly recorded. Now, once the application is written and you're thinking about deploying it, you need to start looking at ensuring that the data processing descriptions are completely accurate, that they accurately describe what's processing, and they actually describe everything that's happening. And you may be looking for test evidence, certain sort of checks and balances in the deployment environment that validate that data processing description. So, for example, it may be that a service is only given access to the data stores that it's got, that it declares it's actually using, rather than access to a broad range of data. And then also you've got reviews by architects and other professionals to validate that the service does what it should. And here I've got a couple of technical people doing it, but you may have security officers and other people who are expert in looking at these services from a privacy perspective, being involved in that process. Now we get into the deployment process, and we need to make sure that the solution is now being deployed onto a secure infrastructure. And so here we need the IT infrastructure team to be aware of what's needed, and to also be thinking about security certification, both of themselves, so that they understand all the issues, and also the platform, the infrastructure that's being used to support the service. And that might be the on-premise platform and also the cloud platform as well, and of course the link between the two. Now, assuming that's all very well, so we've really done the first half of this cycle, from digital planning, digital service development, and digital service deployment. We now get to the point where this service is available. people are signing up to it and they're signing the terms and conditions during the digital service purchase, and they're now using this service. So one of the things that's very valuable is actually to have monitoring running around the service to start to understand the use of data as the service is live, in terms of how many individuals are identified in that data, what's the volume of transactions, both read and write for the data, what are the average consent settings, are people allowing access to data or are they turning everything off, what types of requests and how many requests for data from the data subject requests are you receiving, and any other feedback you're getting. Now, part of this is to obviously help you improve the service, but it's also about understanding what's normal so that you can start to detect when something is going wrong. Maybe you've got an intruder in the system because the use of the number of requests changes or something unusual happens. So this is really about understanding what the normal processing looks like, and that's these data use reports. Because at some point it's possible that that someone actually may steal some of the data, or at least get access to the personal data in your charge. And so and we call this a data breach incident, and there's plenty of examples in the media around it. And it's sometimes the organisation is very quick to find out that there's a problem, but sometimes they actually may be the last to know, and it's only discovered when the data is actually sold or it comes to light through another process that people realise that that data has gone. But nevertheless, it's extremely important that organisations are actively monitoring for suspicious activity and comparing what's really happening with what they understand as normal from those data use reports. Now, obviously most organisations would hope this doesn't happen, but it's still important to have a plan of action and to basically rehearse how this whole, how our data breach would actually be handled. Who is involved, who's responsible for, who's going to lead the investigation, who's going to be responsible for communicating with the regulator, the individuals affected, the media, particularly if it becomes, becomes a very big incident. And without a rehearsal, the organisation can appear disorganised. They might not be effective in actually handling or reducing the impact on people, and they can seriously damage their reputation through a lack of preparedness in this space. So rehearsals are recommended by many organisations who are doing this sort of data protection consultancy. And part of that is actually identifying who should be involved. And so here you can see I'm showing the Chief Security Officer, Privacy Officer, the Chief Data Officer, so the executives that really are concerned about security and data. And then you start to look at the people who understand the service, the owner, which would be Tessa, the architect, the infrastructure person, maybe the developers would be involved. Basically anyone who can help to diagnose, understand what happens, and to resolve it so it doesn't happen again. And that team needs to meet and understand how they work together during the incident. Now, one of the things, of course, that you need to do is gather information. And so the data breach impact assessment is a sort of way of documenting what happened, how it was detected, and if the root cause is known, when it happened, how long it was happening for. Sometimes it might be a continuous leak of information, the estimated volume of loss, who's impacted, and the risk and damage. And having that information to hand where you contact the regulator or whatever shows that you have some understanding of what's, of what you need to do, and will help you get to the bottom of the issue as fast as possible. Now, the flow that I've talked about is really for well organised new development. But of course, in any organisation, there's a lot of stuff going on with people's own initiative and maybe experimentation with data. So I'm going to cover another scenario, which is around data science development. And it's with the data scientist. Her name's Callie. And she's got access to the data lake. And there are a variety of different data items in there, and they're all classified. But one of them is the employee directory, which is actually public. It's not classified at all. And she also finds an open data site that has registration of births in the data set. And so she loads them both and joins them together and realizes she could actually do a birthday card service, which she builds for herself. So here's a digital service. It's not gone through all that planning and data processing descriptions or whatever. She's just done this on her own time. So she builds a service and deploys it and gets it running. But of course, when it runs, there's two problems here. Firstly, she hasn't got the data quite right, so it doesn't work. But secondly, this could be considered a massive invasion of privacy, in terms of what she's done. And not everybody is going to be happy to get an email congratulating them for their birthday. So how does an organization protect themselves from this sort of thing? I mean, you don't want to be saying, well, these people can't do any innovation, can't be involved in building extra things that aren't officially sanctioned. But you do need some sort of thought around how you would prevent this type of thing happening. One of them is employee training, of course. Callie should know that this is a somewhat risky thing to do. The other is that as data is brought into the data lake, it should be properly identified as to where personal data is. And even though these two data sets may not be classified confidential, they actually do contain personal information. And so as the birthday card service is deployed, the deployment process, the DevOps pipelines should actually be picking up from the metadata that actually you've got a service going that's including personal data, and that should set off alarm bells to pick up the fact that this service probably shouldn't be deployed. So there'll always be things that people do individually that the organization can't pick up, and that's why training is important. But there are other things that you need to think about around the less formal processes to help pick up this type of issue. Now, I mentioned Metadata Catalog, which is an area that we're heavily focused on around the Egeria and the ODPi data governance projects. When you look at this life cycle, you see in the center there is the Metadata Catalog. And this is collecting information from different tools, different teams, and assembling it into a coherent structure so that it's possible to say, this digital service, I understand what infrastructure it's deployed on, I understand what the data use processing is, I understand who designed it, what the value to the organization is, where the data is located, etc., etc. So you end up with a complete history of the digital service that is active and accurate, and is then available in the case where there's a request from a data subject or there's an incident that needs investigating. Now, when you actually look at that scope of metadata that's required, there's actually very few products that could span that scope. I mean, that we have very good tools around managing infrastructure. Those databases typically called CCMDBs, configuration management databases. There are repositories that handle data descriptions and other types of definitions. There are different repositories that handle APIs and sort of service type catalogs, and different ones that will cover privacy impact assessments. And that's all fair and reasonable, that throughout the life cycle, you're going to be deploying many different tools. So what we need is not necessarily a single metadata catalog, but the ability for different tools that have metadata catalogs in them to share and link metadata between themselves in an open manner. And this is where Egeria comes in, since it's the technology that allows that linking and sharing of metadata between tools. So if you think about the tools that are in the life cycle of the digital service, as I say, each vendor probably has their own metadata repository, and depending on how the users are using it, they will see different aspects of the end-to-end picture for the digital service. The role of Egeria is around allowing those repositories to actually exchange metadata so that we can build up that complete picture. And it spans, the repositories can then span both the cloud and the on-premise data lake environments through the sharing and distributed querying of metadata. The scope that Egeria covers is descriptions of assets, the infrastructure it runs on, the lineages where the data came from, how it should be governed, and that would include the consent management, the privacy rules and regulations would all be in there. Glossary is where we define what's personal data. Collaboration shows who's involved in different parts of the process. Models and reference data help describe common structures and collect the correct information for different types of service. And metadata discovery allows us to validate that the data in the runtime environment and that's operational is correct. So this is the scope of the type of metadata we think we need. And then we add a set of domain-specific services around the edge that make it easy for different types of tools to connect into that virtual metadata space. So for privacy, for this piece of work, we're adding a new interface, which is APIs and formats for the data privacy assessments and certifications, and an API for a data privacy officer to query and understand what's going on in their organization. So here is a summary of the changes that we're doing. So we're going to have extend the metadata model to include the definition of a digital service, the classification, so is this a controller or a processor, and how they link together, so you can see the dependency chains between the digital services. Then add in all the different types of privacy processes and documents that need to be covered. And then build an archive of categories and other types of reference data that's used in these assessments, so that you can load up and have all these definitions already in your metadata catalog. And then finally, as I said, we're building the API and the event management to provide the privacy officer with a window onto all of this metadata that helps them do their job. And this is just some of the reference data that will be included in that pack, just so you can use it to sort of identify different characteristics of particular services and the data processing around it. And purposes. So, a lot of detail. It's a big topic, and actually, when you start thinking about privacy seriously, you realise that actually it has a huge impact on the way an organisation operates. Many organisations, though, who have taken this seriously are actually making much better use of data. They're improving their data, they're removing the redundancy, and as a result are offering a better service to their customers. So this is not just a cost, it is actually a better way of working and a more respectful way of working with individuals. For us, this first stage has really been around trying to understand where metadata can help, what type of best practices are useful for data privacy officers, and we will be moving into an implementation phase really around Egeria. So a lot of what I've talked about will appear on the wiki and written up in more detail, and we will start to roll out the changes to the Egeria technology, providing the new capabilities. Now, the work that we're doing, this is a multi-company effort. The work that we're doing is actually supported by the ODPi, which is one of the Linux Foundation projects. If you think this is valuable, if you'd like to be a part of this process, please join our calls. And if you're interested in supporting us financially, then please join the ODPi, where you'll have an opportunity to influence our agenda, and also know that you're supporting the infrastructure and the marketing around this effort. So that's the content. Are there any questions from the audience? No questions? Okay.
Hey, Mandy. Can you
hear me? Hi.
Hey, Mandy. Can you hear me? This is Sunil with FedEx.
Hi.
So one of the things, hi. Hey, one of the things that that is slowing down the efforts to implement this kind of cataloging and governance around data seems to be that a lot of organizations, legal and those groups, are handling this effort right now. And data practitioners are really not involved in that effort. So I feel like there will be a lot more traction if people start seeing those fines coming. So has there been cases? I think this became like May 23rd or whenever it became the law, the GDPR law. I mean, have you seen people being fined, or people being, has that happened, or has anybody? Have there been cases?
I think there's been so prior to the GDPR being made law, there was data protection legislation actually in many countries, and there already has been a history of people being fined for not processing data appropriately. I think for the GDPR, there may have been a few questions from the authorities, but I think it's a bit early to tell whether there actually been fines yet, as it's only been in operation a couple of months. But I think we'll start to see it. I think the important thing, as with most governance, that this isn't something that you can, lock down into a small department. It's actually something that the whole organisation needs to embrace. So the developer involved in this needs to be as aware of privacy requirements as the architect, as well as the people using the data in the organisation. So really, the privacy officer, the data officer, are guides. They're catalysts in the organisation. But really, the staff needs to be something that everybody needs to be aware of, just in the same way as security is something that is generally, everyone in the organisation is ensuring that the building's safe, the data's safe, etc. So it does need to be something that expands out across the organisation.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay. Any other questions? Thank you for that. Okay, so as I said, let's switch to this. Yeah, oops. There's an awful lot of information, and it's ever evolving. So please keep checking back to the website if there's information that you want to help us with. If you want to be part of the team, you're very welcome. Please connect to the repositories and follow the instructions to sign up. I appreciate you spending your time on the webinar, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Mandy.
Okay.